Welcome everyone to the third and final session of today's conference. I'm wearing multiple hats today. I was your MC, and right now I'm wearing the hat of a moderator. So in this session, we're going to talk about how to regulate blockchain technologies and other emerging technologies. With the popularity of cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin, Ethereum, and other coins, it is really not far-fetched to say that blockchain technology has become the front and center of the world's attention. And the questions that follow are, how can, or how, should we and can we regulate this technology? What does it mean to regulate this technology that's supposed to be decentralized, that's supposed to be supranational, and who should regulate this technology? What should be the goals when we regulate this technology? Is it any different? So all these questions are debated in various circles today, and we have a great lineup of speakers today to discuss these questions, and I want to briefly introduce them. To my left is Dr. Michèle Finck, who is a senior research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Innovation and Competition. Dr. Finck is currently working on a book on blockchain regulation and governance in Europe, which I believe will be published later this year. And to Dr. Finck's left is Professor Douglas Arner, who is Jerry Holdings Professor of Law at the University of Hong Kong. Professor Arner has published numerous books and articles on international finance law and regulation, and is a member of the Hong Kong Financial Services Development Council. And to Professor Arner's left is Professor Sang-Yong, who is a professor of law at Chungnam National University Law School. He has previously served as a judge for more than 10 years and is a member of the South Korea's Presidential Committee on the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And to his left is Ms. Hyeonseo, who is a Director of Government Relations and Policy at Kakao. She oversees Kakao's government relations related to the IT industry. She has formerly worked as a journalist before joining Down's government relations team. So the format of our session is going to be similar to the previous session. Each of our speakers will present for about 10 minutes, and I will try to let you know if you approach the 10 minutes that was given. And after their presentations, I will turn over the microphone to the speakers so that they can make comments and ask questions to each other. And I will then open the floor for the audience to ask questions and make comments. If you're ready, Dr. Finck, maybe we can start with your presentation.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. It's a huge pleasure to be here today. What I'll try to do in my talk is talk about the relationship between blockchain technology and the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, which was already mentioned a few times before. And I really try to do three different things in my talk. So first of all, I want to give a very, very brief and general introduction as to what blockchain actually is. Then I want to give an overview of the various legal questions that have arisen in relation to blockchain technology in the EU. And then I'll focus on one specific one, namely the relationship between the GDPR and blockchains. And to provide some context, this is a question that has been of huge policy relevance in the past couple of months. So there's relatively large consensus in the EU at this stage that blockchains and the GDPR are not compatible. And at the same time, the EU is very keen on encouraging innovation in relation to blockchain and creating related ecosystems in the EU. So this is really something that has lots of really fascinating legal and also policy implications. Now, just very briefly, what is blockchain? So blockchain has been defined as an append-only replicated database that is maintained by a consensus algorithm and stored on various computers. And the purpose of using such a technology is to allow a network of computers to jointly create and maintain a database of records. There's two things I really want to draw attention to that are more important than the sort of like strict definition itself for our purposes today. The first one is the image. So what you'll see is that there's no unitary structure. Rather, what you have is a network of computers. So when you look at this from a regulatory perspective, this network structure has quite a significant importance, as I'll argue later on. And the second point I really want to make is that there's no such thing as blockchain technology. Rather, when we talk about blockchain, what we really do is talk about a class of technology. There's lots of variety regarding different blockchains that exist. So what I'll say today can only ever be a sort of general assessment of the situation. And I'll focus specifically, or it's probably what I'll say is more accurate in relation to public and permissionless blockchains than it might be for some others. Now, blockchains are generally considered to be a general purpose technology. That means that they can be used for a whole variety of things. And obviously, if that's the case, then there's also a very large variety of legal questions that emerge. And here's just some of those that have been, in part, really hotly debated in the EU in the past couple of months. So the first one is one that will be familiar to many of you because it's a question that has arisen in, I assume, almost all jurisdictions. So it's the legal classification of tokens being the cryptoeconomic incentive mechanisms that are being used in a blockchain context. And obviously the big question here is, are those securities, yes or no? We also have this question in the EU. I think the consensus is that most are, but some aren't, especially that those that are have a function that's more like that of a voucher. And people are now thinking about whether there's a need to introduce a new category, namely that of the utility token, to recognize that. Then there's also been lots of debate regarding the legal classification of smart contracts. I think that's in part due to a misunderstanding of what smart contracts actually do and what they actually are. And this is very EU specific, there's also a discussion as to whether public and permissionless blockchains can be qualified as information society service providers. The implications in the EU being that if that is the case, they fall under a law called the E-Commerce Directive, by virtue of which the individual member states of the EU can't have a very limited leeway to create regulation in relation to that. And then there's the legal status of blockchain data, which is really what I am most interested in. So when we look at this from the EU perspective, we need to distinguish between personal data and non-personal data. Non-personal data is a pretty messy category under EU law that I won't touch on today. So I'll focus on blockchains and personal data. And personal data in the EU is regulated by the EU's General Data Protection Regulation. Much has already been said in relation to this today. Two things I want to emphasize that are important in relation to blockchain is, first of all, the GDPR has a dual objective. On the one hand, it was designed to stimulate and facilitate the free movement of data between the different member states of the EU. So it was designed to make it easier for companies established in different member states to do business throughout the EU. And then the second objective is fundamental rights protection. So to give expression to the right to data protection, which is enshrined in the EU's Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is sort of our Bill of Rights. And this includes giving individuals more control over their personal data, which is a point I'll come back to at the very end of my talk, because this is also something that's being experimented with a lot in the blockchain context. And then the second point I really want to make about the GDPR overall is that the GDPR has a certain presumption as to what a database actually is. So when you look at how the GDPR is drafted, when you look at its drafting history, it's quite clear that the GDPR has this assumption that that in a database, data is centrally collected, centrally stored, and centrally processed. Now, sorry about that. Sorry, can you go back to slides? GDPR has this assumption that data in a database is centrally collected, stored, and processed. Now, blockchains, especially those of a public and permissionless nature, turn this on their head. In a public and permissionless blockchain, you have decentralized collection, storage, and processing of data to the extent that everyone can add data to a blockchain. Transactions are being processed by different miners or validators or whatever that they might be called in a relevant system. And there's also decentralized storage to the extent that various nodes store the data in question. So really what you have is a contrast between a law that was written for centralized databases and a law that was a sort of like technical reality of having a technology that decentralizes all of these elements. Now, of course, this only matters if we find that the GDPR actually applies to blockchain. And this is only the case if we accept that the data that is stored on the blockchain is personal data. And this is something that Julie Brill already mentioned in the beginning, so I'll just be very brief here. I think the point that should really be noted is that the GDPR embraces a very, very broad definition of what personal data is. So the text itself says that personal data is any information that relates to an identified or identifiable natural person, which is called the data subject. And this has been interpreted in a very broad way by the relevant regulators and also the European Court of Justice. So unless you have complete anonymization, personal data will remain personal data as a matter of EU law. So what is the personal data we might find in a blockchain system? There's two different overall categories of such data. The first one is what I refer to as transactional data, which would be data about transactions, messages, etc. And then we also have public keys, which are basically the personal identifiers in a blockchain system. Now, many people assume that this data isn't actually personal data for GDPR purposes because in most cases it will be cryptographically modified. That's not true, however. So there's three different ways in which you can add personal data to a blockchain. One is you would add it in plain text. Of course, if you have personal data, you just add it to the ledger without doing anything to it. It remains personal data. This, however, is very rarely done because it's impractical, it's very expensive. So this isn't something you'll see a lot. Most of the data that's stored on blockchain will either be encrypted or hashed. And there's clear guidance from the relevant European regulators that where you have personal data and you encrypt it, it remains personal data for the reason that because encryption is a two-way function, data can still be unlocked. The same applies to hashing, and this is something that many technologists don't know or disagree with sometimes. So there's clear guidance from the relevant EU regulator that even where you use a hashing process, and this cannot be reverse engineered, personal data remains personal data because especially due to linkability where the input values are known, you could still sort of create the link between the data subject and the data itself. So this means that both transactional data and public keys on blockchains are personal data and thus fall within the scope of the GDPR. Now, what does that mean? As a consequence of this, the GDPR's various substantive provisions must be complied with in a blockchain system. And there's a number of difficulties that arise in this regard. The first one relates to the identifiability of the entity that must actually comply with the GDPR's various provisions. So the GDPR knows this notion of the data controller. The data controller is defined as the entity that determines the purposes and means of data processing. And the big question is, who is this in a blockchain system? And there's a big debate going on in this regard in the EU. I think most people tend to agree that it's the nodes. And of course, if it's the nodes, you have the big problem of how do you address those data controllers? How do you find them? And how are you going to be able to manage a system where you have thousands of different nodes in different jurisdictions? It also means that those data controllers need to implement the GDPR's various substantive rights that data subjects have. And this includes, for instance, the right of data subjects to have their data amended. Now, blockchains are append-only ledgers on which data cannot be changed in principle, at least. So it's very difficult to comply with this right. The same goes for the GDPR's right to erasure, which is the famous right to be forgotten. If you have an append-only ledger, you can't erase data. And it's not clear whether the GDPR would allow for alternative techniques, such as, for instance, the destruction of the private key as an equivalent for such erasure. Then there's other problems that we can see when we try to apply the GDPR to blockchains. So, for instance, the GDPR knows this obligation of data minimization. This means that a data controller can only ever process as much data as they absolutely need to carry out their desired objective. Now, if you think of blockchains as ever-growing append-only ledgers to which data can only ever be added but never deleted, then it's quite clear that we do have a problem in this respect. Another point that's particularly relevant when we look at sort of like big transnational projects, such as the big public and permissionless ledgers, is that the GDPR prohibits the extra EU processing of personal data unless it occurs in a country that has been declared to offer an equivalent degree of protection. Now, if you use a public or permissionless blockchain, you don't know which nodes are going to process, you don't know which miners are going to process your transaction, and it's inevitable that the data will be stored by many different nodes located in many different jurisdictions. So if we look at it from that perspective, it actually becomes clear that such blockchains are incompatible with the GDPR by design, almost, you might say. And then finally, another point that I want to highlight is one that hasn't yet at least gotten as much attention than the other ones in the EU. It's the protection, the prohibition of solely automated data processing under Article 22 GDPR that Brent was mentioning before. And I think in the coming months and years, we'll be seeing a debate as to how this applies to smart contracts. Because there is an argument to be made that smart contracts are a form of solely automated data processing that is caught by this prohibition. And if that is the case, then you can still proceed with such processing under some conditions, in some circumstances. But what you need to do, for instance, is sort of involve a human in the process and also provide information about the existence and maybe contours of such processing to the data subject. And again, it's not entirely clear how you can implement this in a straightforward manner in relation to smart contracts. So really, what we can see when we contrast the GDPR and blockchains and try to apply the GDPR to blockchains, we'll see that there's many different provisions thereof that cannot easily be complied with in those systems. Now, where does this lead us? So we've observed that there's this tension. We've also observed that it's hard to identify who's actually responsible for complying with the GDPR in a blockchain system. And it's equally hard to figure out how the substantive data subjects' rights that data subjects have under the GDPR can be implemented in a blockchain context. So if you look at it from that perspective, it looks like blockchain has hit a roadblock in the EU, and some provocative voices on the industry side like to say that the EU makes blockchain impossible, and it will be impossible to sort of like innovate using this technology in the EU. I don't know if that is true. I think a lot will depend on how regulators interpret the various conflicts we've identified. We know that the European Data Protection Supervisor, which is sort of the most important regulator in this respect, will issue some statement on the compatibility between GDPR and blockchains before the end of the year. We don't know whether that will be guidance or not, but there will be something. And a lot will obviously depend on what approach is taken in that respect. But I do think that despite the incompatibility that you can see, there's still a number of reasons to be optimistic as to why blockchains might be able to continue to exist in a GDPR world. So first of all, if we actually look at the shared objectives between both systems, we can see that at least in some contexts, there's the shared objective of data sovereignty. So the GDPR is very explicit on the fact that one of its key objectives is to give data subjects more control over their personal data. And there's many projects using blockchain technology that try to do the same thing. So there might be some alignment on the meta level that can maybe be translated into compatibility in the future. I think one important thing to also remember in this context is that blockchain remains a somewhat immature technology, and an immature technology is a malleable technology. So sort of being aware of the incompatibility that we see now early on might actually be a chance to incentivize people working with this technology to build it in a GDPR-friendly manner. And then, this is more of a sort of like food for thought I'd like to raise at the end, and it's a point that has come up again and again today, and I think it's a really important point when we talk about technological change and the law, is to think about how law and technology might actually converge to achieve the objectives that are underlying given the legal framework. And okay, well, that's it from me. I say thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the